There is a kind of pain that comes when your child is crying and you are too old, too small, and too human to take the hurt from them. My name is Margaret Ellis. I am 88 years old, and I have lived long enough to watch 3 of my children bury the people they loved most, which taught me that a mother can stand beside grief, but she cannot carry it all the way through for her child. I used to believe there was nothing my children could suffer that I would not somehow absorb. If I loved them fiercely enough, that was the promise I made without saying it when each of them was placed in my arms, damp and furious and alive, their fists closed, as if they had already arrived with something precious to protect. I would feed you. I would warm you. I would stand between you and what frightened you. I would give you the last good piece and pretend I was not hungry. That is the first language of motherhood. You do not speak it in words. You speak it with your body, with lost sleep, with hands under fevered cheeks, with ears trained to hear a cough from 3 rooms away. But children grow past the reach of your arms. They marry. They build houses where you are a visitor. They make promises to someone whose name is not yours. And if you have done your job even halfway well, you learn to step back and be glad. That is what I thought I had done. I had 5 children, and by the time I was in my 60s, I believed I understood the shape of our family. There were birthdays, arguments, grandchildren, crowded holidays, small disappointments, ordinary worries. I thought I knew what I could survive. Then the phone began ringing with news no mother wants to receive, and I learned that there are sorrows that drive through your children, but do not belong to you, no matter how badly you want to claim them. My husband, Walter, and I raised our children in a yellow house on Linden Street, in a town where people knew which porch belonged to which family, and which dog would chase a bicycle, but never bite. Walter worked for the railroad for 38 years, and I worked part-time at the school office once the youngest started 1st grade. We were not fancy people. We paid bills late sometimes, argued over money, reused wrapping paper, and made soup from leftovers. But there was noise in that house, and I miss it more than I can explain. Shoes by the door, lunch boxes on the counter, somebody calling from upstairs that they could not find a sock, Walter asking who had touched his screwdriver, the radio playing too loudly while I tried to think. Our oldest was Paul, serious from the beginning, the kind of boy who lined up his toy cars by color and worried if his younger brothers mixed them. Then came Daniel, gentle and dreamy, always bringing home injured birds or strange rocks he thought were special. Susan was our middle child and the first girl, with a temper like a match and a heart that softened the instant she saw someone lonely. After her came Michael, who laughed before he spoke and could make even Walter shake his head and smile. When he meant to scold him, our youngest was Annie, born when I was nearly 40. Unexpected and adored by everyone. The child who grew up under 5 kinds of supervision and still managed to be the boldest of them all. When they were small, I had all the usual fears. I feared measles, bicycles, deep water, sharp corners, bad friends, broken hearts. I prayed over fevers and sat up during storms. I worried when they learned to drive and worried more when they learned to love. I thought marriage would be the beginning of my relief, in a way. Not because I wanted to hand them off, but because there is comfort in seeing your child chosen by someone else. A mother loves because she must. A spouse chooses and chooses again. And I saw something holy in that Dot Paul married Linda first. She was a school teacher with patient eyes and a laugh that came out only after she trusted you. She and Paul fit together quietly. They were not a showy couple. They sat close on the couch without making a display of it. They bought a little brick house and planted tomatoes along the side fence. When their first son was born, Paul looked at that baby like he had been handed both a treasure and a test. Daniel married Rose, and Rose was brightness in human form. She had red hair when I met her, though later it softened into brown, and she could turn a dull room lively just by entering it. She loved Daniel's gentleness and teased him out of his silences. She was the one who made him dance at weddings, the one who convinced him to take trips, the one who could get him to speak honestly when the rest of us only received a shrug. Susan married Robert, a mechanic with broad hands and a steady voice. I will be honest and say I was not sure about him at first. He seemed too quiet for my Susan, and I feared quiet might mean indifferent. It did not. It meant he listened. He listened to her storms without trying to win them, and over time I saw how safe she felt with him. They had 2 girls, and Robert became the kind of father who sat on the floor after work even when his knees cracked. Michael married later, to a woman named Elaine, after several years of saying marriage was not for him. Elaine had a practical kindness I admired. She could organize a church supper, repair a hymn, calm a crying child, and still tell a man when he was being foolish. She kept Michael from floating too far off the ground, and he kept her laughing when she forgot how. Annie married Tom, a nurse she met during a volunteer event after a flood in the next county. They were both young, younger than I thought they should be for promises as large as marriage. But there was something tender and sturdy between them. He looked at my youngest child with such open affection that I had to forgive him for taking her a little farther from me for several years. Our family grew the way families do when no one is watching closely. Grandchildren arrived. Houses were bought and sold. Jobs changed. Walter retired and complained about being home until he found a dozen things to repair. Holidays became crowded enough that we borrowed folding chairs from the church. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 71, standing at the kitchen sink with my sleeves rolled up, watching through the window as my children and their spouses stood in the yard after dinner. Paul and Linda were speaking softly near the fence. Daniel was laughing at something Rose had said. Susan was leaning into Robert, as if his shoulder had been made for her. Michael was chasing two little boys with a dish towel, and Annie was sitting on the porch steps beside Tom, her head resting against his arm. I thought then, with the kind of gratitude that almost frightens you, they are all held. They are held by someone besides me. I did not know that within 15 years, 3 of them would be standing beside graves. The first was Linda. Paul was 56 when she died, and I was 77. She had been ill for nearly 2 years, though at the start everyone said hopeful things, because hopeful things are what people say when the other choice is too large. Breast cancer, then treatment, then remission for a short while, then the return of it in a form nobody could speak of without looking down. Paul became her caretaker with the same seriousness he had carried since boyhood. He kept notebooks of medication schedules. He learned which foods she could tolerate. He drove her to appointments and sat beside her in waiting rooms. His large hands folded so tightly his knuckles went pale. I visited often, bringing casseroles nobody ate and folded laundry nobody asked me to fold. I wanted tasks. Tasks are a mercy when love has nowhere to go. I could not stop the disease, but I could scrub a sink, change sheets, sit with Linda while Paul went outside to breathe. Linda was gracious even when pain had thinned her patience. She would say, "Margaret, you don't have to do all this." And I would say, "I know," while doing it anyway. I loved her. I loved her not only because she was my son's wife, but because she had become part of the architecture of our family. She knew which pie Paul liked, which grandchild hated peas, which old stories to draw out of Walter when he grew quiet. When someone like that begins to fade, it feels as if rooms inside the family lose their furniture one piece at a time. Near the end, Paul stopped calling me every day. At first I was hurt, and then ashamed of being hurt. He was watching his wife die, and still the mother in me wanted to be needed in the familiar way. One afternoon, I went over without calling and found him sitting on the back steps, still wearing his coat though it was warm. Linda was asleep inside. He looked up at me, and his face was so tired it seemed older than mine. I sat beside him, and for once I did not ask whether he had eaten, or whether the hospice nurse had come, or whether there was laundry to do. I simply sat. After a while he said, Mom, I don't know who I am without her. I had no answer. That frightened me. Mothers are supposed to have answers, or at least the shape of one. When a child is small and says they are afraid of the dark, you can turn on a lamp. When they are hungry, you feed them. When they are sick, you cool their forehead and call the doctor. But when your grown son says he does not know who he is, without the woman he has loved for 30 years, there is no lamp bright enough. I put my hand on his back, and I said the only true thing I had. I'm here. Linda died on a Tuesday just before dawn. Paul called me at 5:18 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock while the phone rang, and even before I answered, I knew. His voice was calm in a way that did not reassure me. She's gone, Mom, he said, not crying, not shaking, just empty. Walter was already gone by then. 3 years buried himself. And I remember wishing suddenly and sharply for my husband, not so he could comfort me, but so he could stand with Paul as a father. There are moments when widowhood becomes new again, because the person missing would have known where to put his hand. The funeral was full. Former students, neighbors, teachers, family, women from church carrying dishes, men in dark suits standing awkwardly near the door. I watched Paul at the front, greeting people, accepting condolences, performing the strange duties of the newly bereaved. His son stood near him, both trying to be strong. I sat in the second row because I wanted to be close enough if he turned, though he did not turn. When the service ended and they closed the casket, I felt something tear through him from where I sat. He did not make a sound, but his shoulders moved, just once, as if his body had been struck from behind. Afterward, people told me how strong he was. I wanted to shout at them, not to admire his strength, because strength was costing him too much. Instead, I nodded, because funerals make polite cowards of us all. In the months after Linda died, I made the mistake most loving mothers make. I tried to keep Paul from falling. I called every morning. I invited him to dinner too often. I cleaned his kitchen when he was at work. I suggested grief counseling, then books, then a walking group, then church again. I watched his face for signs of improvement the way I had once watched his temperature during childhood fevers. If he smiled, I felt relief. If he canceled a visit, I worried. If he spoke of Linda, I leaned into eagerly. If he did not speak of her, I feared he was burying the pain alive. One evening, about 6 months after the funeral, Paul came to my house for supper. I had made pot roast because it had been one of his favorites as a boy. He ate politely, and I talked too much. I told him about a widow from church who had joined a support group. I told him fresh air might help. I told him he should not let the house get too quiet. Finally, he put down his fork and said, not unkindly, Mom, I know you're trying to help, but you keep acting like my grief is a problem you can solve if you find the right tool. That sentence hurt me. I nearly defended myself. I nearly said, I only care, which is what we say when we want our intentions to be judged instead of our effect. But something in his face stopped me. He was not angry. He was exhausted from being observed. He had become a project in my hands, and he was asking to be a man again. I said, I'm sorry. He nodded. Then he said, I need you, but I need you to stop measuring me. That was the first lesson. I wish I could say I learned it completely then, but I did not. Mothers learn slowly when love is frightened. I did try, though. I stopped asking whether he was better. I stopped reporting other people's opinions on grief. When he came over, I let him sit quietly. When he did not come, I let the empty chair remain empty without filling it with panic. Sometimes he would tell a story about Linda and laugh, then cry in the same breath. I learned not to rush either one. Grief does not move away from love. It circles it, touches it, withdraws, returns. 4 years later, it was Susan. Robert died suddenly at 62. A heart attack in the garage, of all places, while changing the oil in their older car. Susan found him. I do not like picturing it, but the mind does not always ask permission. She had gone out to tell him lunch was ready, and there he was on the concrete floor, one hand still near the wrench. Their younger daughter called me from the hospital. Grandma, she said, and then she could not speak. I was 81, sitting at my kitchen table with a half-written grocery list in front of me. By then, I had already buried my husband and watched Paul bury Linda. So you might think I had some practice with tragedy. But practice does not make the next blow gentle. It only teaches your body the route to the floor. Susan had always been the loudest of my children when she was upset. As a girl, she slammed doors, argued fiercely, cried openly. But after Robert died, she went quiet in a way that frightened me more than any screaming could have. At the hospital, she sat with her hands clasped in her lap, staring at nothing. When I reached for her, she let me hold her, but her body was stiff, as if she had not yet understood that she was allowed to collapse. She kept saying, he was just in the garage, not, he is dead, not, I have lost him, just, he was just in the garage, as if the right arrangement of words might place him back there, with grease on his hands and lunch waiting. The funeral for Robert was different from Linda's. Linda's death had approached slowly, terrible, but visible. Robert's had kicked the door open and entered without knocking. People were stunned. The garage was still exactly as he had left it. A rag on the workbench, the hood of the car up, a mug of coffee gone cold. Susan refused to let anyone move anything for weeks. Her daughters worried. I worried too, but I remembered Paul's words, "Stop measuring me." So I sat with Susan in that garage sometimes, both of us on folding chairs beside the car, saying very little. The place smelled of oil, dust, and Robert's old work jacket hanging on a nail. One afternoon, she said, "I keep thinking if I sit here long enough, he'll remember he forgot something and come back." I said, "I know." She looked at me sharply. "Do you?" It was not a cruel question. It was the question grief asks when it feels alone, even in company. I had lost Walter. Yes, I knew widowhood from the inside, but I had not lost Robert as a husband. I had not built my mornings around his footsteps. I had not slept beside his breathing for 38 years. I had lost a son-in-law I loved, and I had lost some part of my daughter's safety. But I did not know exactly what she knew. That was important. I said, "Not the way you do." Her face softened then, and she leaned against me. That was the second lesson. Do not claim a grief because you have suffered something similar. Similar is not same. When we say too quickly, "I know how you feel," we may be trying to comfort, but we can also crowd the grieving person out of their own pain. So I learned to say, "Tell me what it is like today," not because I could fix it, but because I could honor its particular shape. Susan's grief came with anger. That surprised some people, though it did not surprise me. She was angry at Robert for leaving the car unfinished, angry at the doctor for not finding some warning sign, angry at herself for calling him to lunch 15 minutes too late, though the doctors told her it would not have mattered, angry at neighbors who said he was in a better place, angry at couples shopping together in grocery aisles, angry at me sometimes because mothers are safe targets when the true target has disappeared. One morning she called and snapped at me because I had brought over banana bread. "Everyone keeps bringing food," she said, as if carbohydrates raise the dead. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, though it was in Susan's dark way, but because I heard life in her irritation. Then she began to cry, and the cry turned into something raw. I held the phone and let her cry without telling her to breathe, without saying Robert would not want her to suffer, without reminding her of her daughters. There are phrases that sound comforting until you are the one in the wreckage. He would want you to be happy. At least he went quickly. You have to be strong for the children. All of them may contain some truth, but truth delivered too soon can bruise. After a few months, Susan began coming to my house on Sundays. Not every Sunday, but often. She would bring laundry sometimes, though she had her own washer, and I understood that the laundry was an excuse. We folded towels at my kitchen table the way we had when she was young. Some days she talked about Robert nonstop. Some days she complained about insurance forms, leaky faucets, the terrible loneliness of buying food for one. Once she said, "People keep inviting me to things, but they look relieved when I say no." I knew what she meant. Grief makes people generous at first and then uneasy. They want you included, but they also want you manageable. They want your sadness to have edges they can step around. Watching Susan taught me something I had not understood even after Walter died. A widow does not only lose a person, she loses the version of herself that existed in that person's presence. Susan had been Robert's wife in 1,000 tiny ways no one saw. She knew how he liked his coffee, which shirts he wore for dirty jobs, how he sighed when a bill was higher than expected, how he pretended not to enjoy the cat. After he died, all those knowings had nowhere to go. I saw that in Paul too, but with Susan I saw it more plainly, because she named everything. Who am I supposed to remind about his cholesterol now? She said once, and then looked embarrassed. But I understood. Love becomes habits, and when the person is gone, the habits remain like hands reaching into empty air. The third was Annie, my youngest, and that one nearly broke something in me I had believed was already well cracked. Tom died after a long illness that began when he was only 58. A neurological disease, slow and unfair, taking his balance first, then his strength, then his speech. Annie became a caregiver before she became an old woman, and I had to watch my youngest child lift, bathe, feed, and interpret the man who had once carried her laughing across a muddy yard. By then I was 85, and my own body was less reliable. My knees hurt. My hands shook when I was tired. I could not do what I had done for Linda. I could not scrub floors for hours, or drive at night, or lift heavy laundry baskets. I was a mother with love still roaring inside me, trapped in a body that had become cautious. That is another sorrow people do not speak of. To grow old while your child suffers is to feel the old instinct rise in a body no longer fully able to obey it. I wanted to move in with Annie. I wanted to take the night shift. I wanted to lift Tom from the bed, argue with doctors, cook for everyone, make the house run smoothly enough that my daughter could rest. Instead, I could sit for 3 hours at a time, read to Tom when his eyes were good, stir soup slowly, and fold small towels. I hated the smallness of my help. I hated needing help myself while Annie needed me. Annie never complained to me about that, which somehow made it harder. She would say, "Mom, just being here helps." I believed she meant it, but I also saw the shadows under her eyes. I saw her shoulders tightening when Tom tried to speak, and she could not understand him. I saw her step into the pantry and press both hands to her face before coming back out cheerful. Caregiving grief begins before death. That is what I learned then. Annie was losing Tom in pieces while still feeding the body that held him. Every decline required mourning, then adjustment, then another decline. People ask how someone is doing, and you want to say, which part of them, which part of us, which lost today. One evening, I sat beside Tom while Annie showered. The house was dim, and a lamp near his chair made his face look younger and older at once. He could still speak a little then, though slowly. He looked toward the hallway where Annie had gone and said, with effort, "She's tired." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry." I took his hand. It was thinner than it should have been, but still warm. I told him, "She loves you." A tear slid down his cheek, and he said, "I know. That's why." I have thought about those words many times. That's why. Love was the reason for the care, and also the reason the care hurt. Annie would not have been so tired if she loved him less. Tom would not have felt such sorrow at being cared for if he loved her less. I sat there holding his hand and understood again that love does not protect us from suffering. It gives suffering a name and a face. Tom died at home with Annie beside him. She called me afterward, and when I answered, she said, "Mama." She had not called me Mama regularly since she was 12. At 86 years old, I heard my youngest child become small again through one word, and every year between her birth and that phone call folded into nothing. I could not drive there myself. That is another fact I still dislike admitting. It was late. Rain was falling, and my eyes were not good at night. My granddaughter came to get me. I sat in the passenger seat with my purse in my lap, furious at time, furious at my own bones, furious that my baby had called for me, and I had to wait for someone else to carry me to her. When I arrived, Annie was sitting on the edge of the bed beside Tom's body, holding his hand. The hospice nurse was in the kitchen, making calls. The room was quiet, too quiet for a room where a marriage had just ended. I sat beside Annie, and she leaned into me the way she had as a child after a nightmare. But she was not a child, and I was not the mother who could lift her back into bed and tuck the blanket under her chin. She was a widow with grown children of her own, and I was an old woman with swollen knees, sitting beside the body of a man I had loved like a son. She said, "I don't know how to stop taking care of him." That was the sentence that opened Annie's grief. Not I do not know how to live without him, though that came later. Not I cannot bear it, though that was true. I don't know how to stop taking care of him. For years, her love had been organized around medication times, appointments, careful meals, transfers from chair to bed, washing, watching, listening. Death ended Tom's suffering, but it also took away the purpose that had carried Annie through exhaustion. The next morning, there would be no pills to crush, no sheets to change, no water cup to refill, no weak voice to interpret. People imagine relief after long caregiving, and relief may come, but it is not simple. Relief can arrive holding hands with guilt. After Tom's funeral, Annie slept at my apartment for 3 nights. She did not want to be in her house, and I did not want her alone. She slept in the small guest room, and I lay awake listening for her the way I had listened when she was a baby. In the middle of the second night, I heard her get up and go to the kitchen. I found her standing at the sink, drinking water, looking lost. I woke up because I thought I heard him, she said. I nodded. She said, then I remembered I don't have to check on him. And then I felt awful, because for 1 second, I was glad. There it was, the terrible honesty of grief after caregiving. I went to her and put my arms round her. She wept into my shoulder, and I did not tell her not to feel guilty. I had learned enough by then to know that guilt is not dismissed by instruction. I said, that sounds like love and exhaustion meeting each other. She cried harder, but her body loosened. Sometimes the only comfort is naming a thing without judging it. By the time Annie buried Tom, I had become a mother to 3 widowed children. Paul without Linda, Susan without Robert, Annie without Tom, Michael and Daniel were still with their wives, thank God, though I had learned not to say such things carelessly. I had also lost Walter, which meant I knew widowhood as my own country. But watching my children enter it was different. When Walter died, I grieved the man I had loved since I was 19. I grieved our morning routines, his coat by the door, the way he cleared his throat before saying something serious. But when my children lost their spouses, I grieved in layers. I grieved the person who died. I grieved the child who survived. I grieved the grandchildren, watching their parents break. I grieved the family future that had rearranged itself without permission. People sometimes said to me, "You must be so strong." I came to dislike that word. Strong often means you have not yet fallen where others can see. I was not strong. I was old and practiced at continuing. There is a difference. I paid bills, attended funerals, answered phone calls, remembered birthdays, and went home to cry into dish towels because my children had enough tears of their own. I learned to carry tissues in every coat pocket. I learned which rooms in funeral homes had chairs with arms because getting up from low couches had become difficult. I learned that casseroles are both inadequate and necessary. I learned that grief has a smell sometimes, like flowers left too long in warm rooms. I also learned the limits of my place. That was the hardest lesson of all. When your child is born, their pain feels like a command. The baby cries, and your milk lets down, the toddler falls, and your arms move before thought. The school child comes home wounded by another child's cruelty, and your whole body wants to march somewhere and set the world straight. That instinct never leaves. At 88, when Paul's voice changes on the phone, I still sit up straighter. When Susan says she had a bad day, I still want to put on my shoes. When Annie sounds tired, I still look toward the door, as if I can reach her by will alone. Motherhood does not retire from the body, but grown children are not extensions of you. Their grief is not a parcel they can hand over, though they may rest it beside you for a while. I used to think love meant taking as much pain as possible from the people you loved. Now I think love, at least at this age, means becoming a steady place where their pain can exist without being rushed, corrected, compared, or taken hostage by your own fear. That took me a long time. With Paul, I tried to manage grief. With Susan, I had to learn not to claim it. With Annie, I had to accept that I could not even help as much as I wanted. Each child taught me by needing something different. Paul needed space without abandonment. Susan needed witness without explanation. Annie needed permission to feel more than one thing at once. And all three needed a mother who could bear not being the answer. I failed often. I still fail. There were times I called too much, times I spoke too soon, times I used my own widowhood as a bridge when silence would have been kinder. Once, after Robert died, I told Susan, the second year is harder in some ways because it had been for me after Walter. She looked at me and said, Mom, I am just trying to get through breakfast. She was right. I had carried my map into her wilderness and expected it to help. But grief does not always follow the trails other people leave. Another time, I asked Paul whether he thought he would ever marry again. I asked gently, or so I thought, but his face closed. Linda has been gone a year, he said. I said, I didn't mean now. He said, then why ask now? I apologized, but I remembered the sting. Not because he had been unfair, but because he had caught me trying to look ahead in order to escape where he still was. Parents do that. We look for the next chapter because the current one is unbearable. But a grieving person may not be ready to become a story with a hopeful ending. They may still be standing in the sentence that broke them. With Annie, I made a different mistake. I praised her too much for being devoted. Everyone did. You are so strong. You are an angel. Tom is lucky to have you. Those things were true in one way, but they also trapped her. If everyone calls you selfless, where do you put the thoughts that are not selfless? Where do you put the resentment, the exhaustion, the moment you wish for one uninterrupted night more than you wish to be noble? One afternoon, Annie snapped at me, please stop making me sound better than I am. I was startled. She said, I need to be allowed to hate this. After that, I tried to say different things. This is hard. You look tired. I can sit with him while you leave the house. Ordinary words, but more useful. I tell you these failures because old age has made me suspicious of stories where wisdom arrives clean. Mine did not. Mine arrived after I had said the wrong thing, after I had mistaken worry for help, after my children had the courage to correct a mother who was only trying to love them. I am grateful they did. Some parents cannot bear correction from their grown children. They treat every boundary as disrespect. I understand the temptation. It is painful to be told that your help hurts. But if your child trusts you enough to tell you the truth, even a hard truth, that is not the end of love. Sometimes it is love asking to survive in a healthier shape. There are things I know now about grief from a mother's side that I did not know when Walter died. I know that the grieving child may look like a stranger for a while. Paul became quieter, almost formal. Susan became sharp and unpredictable. Annie became tender one moment and unreachable the next. At first, I wanted to coax them back into who they had been. I missed my familiar children. Then I understood that they were not misbehaving. They were reorganizing around an absence. You cannot lose the person who shared your bed, your bills, your private jokes, your future plans, and remain exactly arranged as before. I know that holidays become complicated territories. The first Christmas after Linda died, Paul came to my house and sat in Walter's old chair, looking at the tree as if it belonged to another family. The first Thanksgiving after Robert died, Susan brought his favorite cranberry relish and then could not eat it. After Tom died, Annie stayed home on New Year's Eve and texted me at midnight. I made it 2 words. I understood they meant more than any speech. I wrote back, "Yes, you did." Then I sat in the dark and cried because making it can be such a lonely victory. I know that grandchildren grieve in ways adults often miss. Paul's sons became too helpful, the way young men sometimes do when they are afraid of their own sadness. Susan's daughters were angry with each other for months because each believed the other was grieving wrong. Annie's children had already lost pieces of their father during his illness, and after he died, they seemed both devastated and relieved, then ashamed of the relief. I wanted to gather them all at my kitchen table and say, there is room for every version of this. But families do not always learn together. Sometimes each person has to find a private corner of the loss and sit there until they can speak. I know that the dead remain present in practical ways. Linda's handwriting on recipe cards, Robert's tools in coffee cans, Tom's medical supplies stacked in a closet after no one needed them. People say memories live in the heart, and they do, but they also live in junk drawers, coat pockets, freezer containers, passwords, the dent in a pillow, the extra toothbrush nobody wants to throw away. I have watched my children stand before ordinary objects as if facing a cliff. A pair of shoes can undo a person. So can a grocery list with 2 kinds of cereal on it. I know that time does not heal the way people promise. Time changes grief. It gives it more rooms to move through. It teaches the body that the person is not coming back, which is its own terrible education. But I would not tell any grieving person that time will heal them, as if grief is an illness and years are medicine. Paul still turns his head when he hears a laugh like Linda's. Susan still keeps Robert's old jacket in the hall closet. Annie still wakes early some mornings because her body remembers medication schedules. Are they healed? I do not know. They are living. That may be the more honest word. And I know that a mother's helplessness is not uselessness. That one took me longest. I confused helpless with worthless. If I could not remove the grief, I thought I had failed. But there were moments when my children later told me what mattered, and they were almost never the things I thought were important. Paul remembered me sitting beside him on the back steps without talking. Susan remembered the afternoons in the garage when I did not tell her to come inside. Annie remembered me saying that love and exhaustion could meet without making her a bad wife. They did not remember the casseroles as much as the permission to be exactly as broken as they were that day. I am 88 now. My world is smaller than it was, but it is not empty. Paul calls every Wednesday evening. Sometimes he talks about Linda, sometimes about his garden, sometimes about nothing at all. Susan comes by with groceries and pretends she was going to the store anyway. Annie brings me library books and stays for tea when she can. Daniel and Michael visit too, with their wives, and I hold gratitude carefully around them because I know how quickly ordinary can become before. The family still gathers, though not in the old crowded way. There are empty places now, not just chairs, but conversations that no longer happen because the people who carried them are gone. At our last Thanksgiving, Paul made Linda's sweet potatoes. Susan brought Robert's cranberry relish. Annie wore a scarf Tom had given her years before. No one announced these things. We noticed quietly. That is another way grief matures. It does not always need to be spoken loudly to be present. Sometimes it sits at the table, not unwelcome, not welcome exactly, but acknowledged. The meal was not the same as the old days. It could not be. Walter was gone. Linda, Robert, and Tom were gone. The grandchildren were adults with complicated schedules and babies of their own. My hands trembled when I passed the gravy. But there was laughter too, real laughter, not a betrayal of the dead, but a sign that love had found another room. Near the end of the evening, I looked around and saw my children as they are now, not as I still sometimes imagine them. Paul with gray in his beard, Susan rubbing one sore knee, Annie helping a toddler wipe mashed potatoes from her chin, Daniel telling a story too slowly, Michael laughing before the punchline. I saw the grief each one carried, visible to me because I am their mother. And I saw also that they had carried it farther than I could have carried it for them. I had walked beside them. Yes, I had steadied them sometimes, but they had done the walking. That realization hurt and comforted me at once. When you are young, you may think the great test of motherhood is keeping your children safe. When you are old, you learn that safety was never fully in your hands. You can fasten seat belts, teach caution, cook nourishing meals, say prayers, choose good schools, warn against foolish people, and still the world can enter. Illness enters, accidents enter, the body fails. Love binds itself to another mortal person and calls that courage. Then a mother must watch what she cannot prevent. I have asked myself whether I would spare my children love to spare them grief. The answer is no, though I do not say it lightly. I have seen Paul broken by Linda's absence, but I also saw who he became because she loved him. I have seen Susan rage over Robert's death, but I remember the steadiness he gave her for nearly 40 years. I have seen Annie hollowed by Tom's illness, but I know the tenderness between them was not made meaningless by the suffering at the end. Grief is not proof that love was a mistake. It is proof that love became part of the structure, and when it was removed, the whole house shook. If you are a parent listening to me, and your grown child is grieving, I want to speak to you plainly. You will want to fix what cannot be fixed. You will want to say the perfect thing. You will want to make them eat, sleep, answer messages, move forward. Remember the children. Consider the future. Stop crying. Start crying. Do anything that proves they are not being swallowed whole. Some of those urges come from love, but some come from your own terror. Learn the difference as best you can. Your child's grief will frighten you, but do not make them comfort you for witnessing it. Sit down beside them. Bring the soup, but do not demand they eat it. Say the name of the person who died, unless they ask you not to. Let them tell the same story more than once. Do not compare their grief to yours, even if yours is deep. Do not turn their spouse into a saint, because saints are hard to mourn honestly. Do not rush them toward gratitude, purpose, or closure. Closure is a tidy word for people standing outside the room. Inside the room, love leaves drawers open everywhere. And when you go home, because eventually you will have to go home, let yourself cry too. A mother's grief for a grieving child is real. It is not the same grief, but it is real. You have lost the world as it was for them. You have lost some ease in their face. You have lost the illusion that age gives you authority over pain. Be gentle with yourself for that, but do not make your child responsible for soothing it. Find a friend, a journal, a quiet kitchen, a church pew, a walk around the block. Put your sorrow somewhere strong enough to hold it without asking your child to carry yours on top of their own. I think often of the day each of my children was born. Paul red-faced and indignant, Daniel blinking at the world as if he had questions already, Susan screaming with the full force of her lungs, Michael smiling in his sleep before anyone said babies could do such things, Annie small and fierce in the crook of my arm. I thought then that motherhood meant I would never let them suffer alone. I still believe that, but I understand it differently now. Not alone does not mean without pain. Not alone does not mean I can enter the deepest chamber of their grief and rearrange it. It means I wait nearby. I answer the phone. I remember the anniversaries. I allow silence. I keep loving the ones they lost. I do not turn away because I am helpless. There are nights when I speak to Walter as if he is in the next room. I tell him about the children. I tell him Paul is managing. Susan is still stubborn. Annie is tired but steadier. I tell him our family has been through more funerals than I wanted, as if any number would have been acceptable. I imagine him listening in that patient way he had, one hand in his pocket, saying, "They're stronger than you think, Maggie," and perhaps he would be right. But I would answer, as I always did, "I know." That doesn't make it easier to watch. No, it does not make it easier. But it does make me proud, in a quiet way. Not proud that they suffered, never that. Proud that they have loved deeply enough to grieve deeply and still, somehow, remain tender. Paul plants tomatoes every spring because Linda did. Susan finally donated most of Robert's work clothes, but kept the jacket. Annie volunteers once a month with hospice families now, not because she has moved on, but because she understands the room. Their lives are not what they were. They are not what I wanted for them, but they are lives still opening in places. At 88, I no longer ask God to keep sorrow away from everyone I love. I did once. I prayed like a woman, making bargains with the sky. Now my prayers are smaller and harder. Let me not turn away. Let me not speak too quickly. Let me know when to help and when to sit still. Let my children feel loved without feeling watched. Let the names of Linda, Robert, and Tom remain welcome in our family. Let the grandchildren learn that grief is not something to be ashamed of. Let me leave behind, when my own time comes, not a family untouched by sorrow, because no such family exists, but a family less afraid to carry it together. So if you are listening tonight with a child who is hurting, or with a parent who cannot fix what has happened to you, maybe this old mother's voice can offer one small truth. Love has limits, but those limits are not failures. A mother cannot breathe for her child forever. She cannot swallow their grief, cannot bargain their loneliness away, cannot make the bed less empty or the funeral less final. But she can stand at the edge of what cannot be changed and refuse to leave. She can say, "I'm here," and mean it without trying to make those words larger than they are. Sometimes that is all we are given. Sometimes that is enough for 1 hour, and then the next hour, and then the next. And in a life where so much can be taken from us, the quiet faithfulness of staying near may be the last and best thing a mother has left to give.